Hello everybody. This video will very briefly go over some of the ins and outs of politics in the 1950s, starting with some stuff that happened right before the 1950s and then carrying on toward the end of the decade. So before we go into the 50s themselves, let's talk about 1948. There's a book by David Halberstam called The Fifties, which is a very exhaustive account of the entire decade. And it actually starts in 1948 because what happens in the 1948 election has a good bit of importance going forward into the decade of the 1950s. So you might recall Harry Truman takes over for FDR when he died in 1945. So Truman runs for his own full term in the 1948 election. He had been fairly unpopular because not a lot had gotten done during his first few years in office. He was being challenged by the governor of New York, Tom Dewey, who had run and lost against FDR in 1944. And it looked leading up to the election that Dewey was going to win. Truman decided to try to stage a last-ditch effort to come back in that election, took a train trip all around the country, screaming to anyone who would listen virtually at every train stop along the way about the do-nothing, good-for-nothing Congress, blaming the Republicans who controlled Congress for the impasse on various legislation that was going on at the time. And sure enough, Truman comes back and wins a fairly decisive victory, as you can see from the map, on election night. It did not stop the Chicago Tribune from going to press early, anticipating that Dewey would win. And so that leads to the famous picture there you see at the bottom called The Last Laugh, which shows Truman triumphantly and gloatingly holding up the newspaper that proclaimed his defeat when in fact he had won re-election. But despite the fact that Democrats win this election, what you begin to see is the crack in that solid South that you can trace back to the end of Reconstruction all the way back in the 1870s that we've talked about in this class already if you're one of my students. Truman had supported some civil rights legislation, such as integrating the Army. We'll talk about that more in a second. But his support for civil rights expansion leads to Southern delegates walking out of the Democratic Convention in 1948 and creating a third party that becomes known as the States' Rights Democratic Party, or colloquially known as the Dixiecrats. And they ran their own candidate for president, who was the governor of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond, who would go on to be a longtime senator from South Carolina. He would eventually switch parties and become a Republican. Primarily, again, the Dixiecrats' platform was opposing civil rights expansion for blacks. They do manage 39 electoral votes, all in the South, but not enough to keep Truman from winning. Now, the solid South kind of reemerged in the 1950s. There were no significant third-party challenges in the 1950s, but starting in the 60s, you begin to see that crack occur again and then kind of complete itself by the 1970s when the South starts to shift to the Republican Party. Once Truman has his own term in office, he proposes a battery of domestic programs that become known as the Fair Deal. Civil rights is part of that. As we mentioned earlier, he does sign an executive order in 1948 to integrate the armed forces. Remember, that was not done during World War II by FDR. FDR only integrated defense industry, not the military itself. The Army remains segregated through the end of World War II and then a few years after. There's also the expansion of health and welfare programs, similar to what you would have seen during the New Deal, but maybe going a little bit further. Federal funding going to poorer school districts to help provide lunch to students. Amending Social Security to include disability. So if someone was injured or ill to the point where they could not work, Social Security would help pick up what was called disability insurance, or colloquially now known as disability, where you receive payments in lieu of being able to work. The first minimum wage had been passed in 1938. I believe it was 50 cents an hour. It was raised in 1950 to 75 cents an hour. Adjusted for inflation in 2021, that's about 8 1/4. So if you adjust for inflation, it was better then than it is now. More federal funding going into public housing, trying to keep poor people out of slums, creating better affordable housing for them in cities. Some of these start off well-intentioned and fairly well-kept. Many of them end up becoming havens for gang activity and high crime and stuff like that. The picture you see there on the bottom left is a housing project, a former housing project in Chicago called Cabrini Green, which was a pretty notorious one as the drug trade picked up, especially in the 1970s, 1980s, very high crime rates, etc. So a lot of that happens to the public housing that was created in the middle of the 20th century as funding kind of lagged for those things. So Truman does a good bit for domestic policy. He wanted to model the Fair Deal after the New Deal and wanted to create even more programs that it would have done a lot of good for people. But a lot of money and a lot of Truman's attention ultimately was taken up by the Korean War. So his presidency becomes fairly overshadowed by foreign policy. And of course, the Korean War becomes a fairly unpopular one as it drags on just a few years after World War II, which leads to Truman's popularity going way, way, way down, which ends up hurting the Democratic Party in 1952. So in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower runs for president. Of course, he was the commanding Supreme Allied Commander during World War II in Europe. He didn't really wear his politics on his sleeve. Most people in America did not really know where he stood politically. He was courted by the Republicans and the Democrats to run on their ticket for president in 1952. He ultimately chose the Republican ticket. But Eisenhower was not terribly conservative, and there were a lot of people on the Republican side, like Senator Bob Taft from Ohio, and others who were not real happy with the fact that Eisenhower had become the party's standard bearer because they didn't see him as being a true Republican or a true conservative. So to try to balance out the ticket and get the conservatives on board, he nominated a California senator named Richard Nixon, you may have heard of him before, as his running mate. And Richard Nixon leads to the most dramatic moment of the 1952 election when he is very nearly kicked off the ticket because of allegations of accepting illegal campaign gifts and contributions and stuff like that, which is kind of foreshadowing for what happens to Richard Nixon when he's president in the 70s during Watergate. Nixon saves his spot on the ticket by going on national TV and laying out in fairly emotional terms, what he owed and what his family had and all of that, and vehemently denied any wrongdoing. And then he ended the speech by saying that he had in fact taken one campaign contribution from a Republican political donor, and it was a puppy, and his daughters loved that puppy and they named it Checkers, and no matter what, they were never given that dog back. And it became known as the Checkers speech. And everyone's like, oh, Nixon likes dogs. And Eisenhower decided to save him on the ticket, and they win the presidency in 1952. They win the election. The Democrats had run the governor of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, who was seen as someone who was liberal, but also very cerebral and could stand up to Soviet aggression throughout Europe and the rest of the world. It was just that the 1952 election is kind of similar to 1920, the idea of that whole return to normalcy bit, and America was kind of in a conservative mood and didn't want that high-mindedness. Adlai Stevenson was kind of like your Woodrow Wilson type in that way. And so Stevenson was just kind of not the man for the moment, I guess you could say. And as you can see from the map there on the lower right, Eisenhower wins a fairly convincing victory, both in popular vote and in the Electoral College. So once Eisenhower becomes president, the Republicans were in charge of the presidency for the first time in 20 years. He was the first Republican president since Hoover in the early 30s. And so a lot of Republicans in Congress and throughout the country thought that, they would finally have a chance to roll back a lot of the New Deal programs that had been put in place, and even some of the Fair Deal stuff that Truman had done, this massive expansion of the welfare state and everything else, and saw this as their opportunity. But remember, we said Eisenhower was not particularly conservative, and he doesn't do any of those things. In fact, he sort of goes the other direction, and he expands Social Security programs like disability and unemployment, and the minimum wage in 1956 goes up to $1 an hour, so a 25% increase there. The budget ended up balanced 3 out of 8 years. Remember, budget balanced means that the government in that particular year brings in more money than it spends. Marginal tax rates were pretty high in the 1950s, so it was pretty easy to balance the budget out. Even the years where the the budget didn't balance, the deficits really weren't that high. It's worth arguing probably that Eisenhower might have been the best president of the 20th century when it came to economics. When you look at just the almost nonstop prosperity that occurred throughout that decade. One place where Eisenhower fell flat initially was on civil rights. As things were happening in, the South, such as the murder of Emmett Till and the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks and everything, Eisenhower had not done much to speak out about the potential expansion of rights for African Americans throughout the country. And it wasn't that he necessarily opposed civil rights. It just wasn't something that he considered a priority for him until 1957, when the Little Rock crisis happened and Eisenhower sends the 101st Airborne to Arkansas to enforce the integration of the all-white Central High School in Little Rock. That was, of course, also, spearheaded by the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, which was led by Earl Warren, the Chief Justice at the time, who had been appointed by Eisenhower in 1953. Eisenhower was very popular. He gets reelected in 1956. The Democrats ran Adlai Stevenson again, thinking it would go any better or possibly better, and it didn't. Finally, just wanted to point out the biggest domestic program of Eisenhower's presidency, which was the Highway Act of 1956. Eisenhower had seen the Autobahns in Germany during World War II and realized that the infrastructure that those roads provided to Germany in wartime and as a public service were very important. And so he encouraged the passage of this act, which led to the creation of 42,000 miles of interstate highways all over the country, which made it easier to get from place to place, at least the expansion of the suburbs. So, people could very easily via interstate commute from the suburbs into cities for work. People could travel all over the country. Led to, family vacations to Disneyland in California and stuff like that. Ends up taking a long time, ends up being very, very expensive, but is the act that transforms America's landscape physically probably more than anything else that had ever been done in American history. And it is known officially as the Eisenhower Interstate System. And occasionally you will see those signs on interstate road markers around the country. That is all for this video. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments, or if you're one of my students, feel free to shoot me an email or message on Classroom. Cheers.